What the fuck are you talking about? Well of Ascension is 1, a great book, 2, a great sequel, and 3, a great setup for the final book. I loved the sequel. I don't know what you're talking about. Did you just roast the entire Mistborn saga based on your opinion of Well of Ascension? To make an opinion of the saga, you should read the entirety of it. Imagine not liking Well of Ascension. Excuse me? Book 3 is the GOAT though. Good taste is not for everyone. Completely disagree. Oof. Bad take. Lazy React YouTuber is less than masterful writer and storyteller. Read the 3rd book. Am I really gonna do this again? Earlier in the year, I read The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, and I vlogged my experience. If you watch that, you will know that I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. So I went into The Well of Ascension with very high hopes and expectations. I also vlogged my experience of reading that. And if you've watched that, you will know my expectations crashed and burned very quickly. This is my least favorite book I have read of 2022, and I have read over 100 books, so that's saying something. I hated it. And ooh, are the Sanderfans mad at me for saying that? I get it, okay? Brandon Sanderson is a hugely beloved author. Honestly, his Kickstarter was just like a flex on all of us. I know I'm in the minority, don't worry. And to be clear, I have read 4 books by Brandon Sanderson. I'm not entirely new to this. My point though is that I've had very mixed results with my 4 books that I've read of him. And I think giving an author 4 tries is reasonably generous. However, I'm gonna be extra generous today. I'm gonna give him 1 last go. Partly I want to do this just so that I can say that I'm finished. So I can finish a trilogy, feel good about myself. But also, I keep getting comments from you Sanderfans on that silly short that I made. Honestly, it was just like such a throwaway thing for me to make, and yet it has gotten more traction than anything I've ever done on this channel since leaving my TarotTube channel. Some of you are downright mean, but some of you make some interesting points. And I keep hearing from a number of you that although maybe Well of Ascension doesn't work for everybody, and you can appreciate that, some of you think that Hero of Ages is honestly a masterwork, and it is worth every moment of the previous 2 books for the build up for this. So I'm gonna see if you're right. If another 800 pages of Brandon Sanderson can turn this ship around and turn me from a hater to a lover. Let's find out. Before we get stuck in though, I have one confession to make. And that is, I am convinced, I know, the big reveal that everyone keeps talking about being like the best reveal in fantasy. I had a pretty good sense of what I thought was gonna happen. Maybe not the details, but like a specific character. I had a pretty strong feeling of that. I'd say 30% of the way into the Well of Ascension. And before I get started, I'm just gonna make this very clear. This is an entirely spoiler-filled video. If you don't wanna be spoiled for this book, don't watch anymore. And I've literally had a conversation with someone over 3 months ago on this post about this. They said that the Hero of Ages brings everything from the previous 2 books together. And I responded explaining the fact that I'm kind of tired of Brandon Sanderson's cliches that it's very clear that he likes to use. I don't really like him as a storyteller so far, and also that I'm convinced that I know who the hero is. And they responded with, spoiler, it's not Vin. And I was like, of course it's not Vin. No one was thinking that it was Vin. So I responded, I didn't think it was Vin. I think it's Sazed, because he feels like a self-insert for Sanderson, and that just feels like something he would do. So I'm putting that out here right now, that I think Sazed is the Hero of Ages. And I think it's really obvious. Not because there's been some like incredible foreshadowing, but because Sanderson feels like the kind of author who would make his self-insert the unexpected hero. And who knows, maybe I'm entirely wrong and I will look like a clown at the end of this. And won't that be fun for you to watch? So just in case you're not reading the books along with me, Sazed is kind of like this secondary character in books 1 and 2. He's kind of been helping the supposed heroes quite a lot, but basically he's from a different race of people, and he is like this very religious, philosophical kind of man. And honestly, he's a bit of an outcast from his own people because he does things, he's just a bit unorthodox. He's not like other religious people, you know what I mean? And he just feels, to my bones, it feels like Sazed is a self-insert for Brandon Sanderson. And that is why I am convinced that he has written this whole story to make himself the hero. And I would be hard pushed to think of anything more insufferable than that. So let's find out if I'm right. So I'm just over halfway through and I am so bored. I think I said something very similar when I was reading Well of Ascension, that stuff is happening, but at least for the first, I mean, more than half now, it's just not very interesting to me. As with the first few books, we're following a few different perspectives and our characters are in different locations. Primarily, we're following Elend and Vin as they're basically like collecting a Colossus army, which are these big blue giants with saggy skin that they can mind control. They're collecting this army and besieging a city because they believe that the Lord Ruler has left them like stockpiles of food and maybe hints about how to defeat the ruin, the big bad in this book, in these like caverns underneath a handful of cities. And this is the last one they think that they need to find. But of course, the guy who is currently in charge of this city isn't super keen on just like letting Elend and Vin into his city with their big blue giants. So they're in a standoff. Spook was a pretty secondary character in the earlier books, and he seems to be much more important in this one. And he is like up on a mission in another city. And basically it is being run by a guy who is professing to be like living by the values and rules set out by the survivor, Kelsia. And basically what that means is that Scar need to rule themselves and all nobles need to be slaughtered. Spook himself used to be a very quiet, meek kind of character. He was definitely more tagging along rather than a part of the main crew. Whereas in this book, he sort of seems to be getting up to some new things. He also seems to have managed to acquire a secondary power, and it's kind of gone to his head a little bit. He is hearing voices. He's hearing primarily the voice of Kelsia, and it is sort of directing him to do certain things and to become basically a hero in the name of Kelsia. And I suppose I wanted to comment on the voices because there are a lot of voices that a lot of people are hearing. And in the second book, obviously, we saw Zane, who was a bit of an unhinged character. If you haven't watched my video reading The Well of Ascension, just know that I really disliked that representation. I thought it was offensive. Even though we find out that these voices were probably something to do with the mists or ruin or whatever, Brandon Sanderson as an author relied on some really harmful stereotypes in order to create tension and make Zane a scary character. And I think that's fucked up. But anyway, a lot of characters are hearing voices. That seems to be a big part of this book. Spook is definitely one of them. And also Vin herself. I mean, right from book one, she was always sort of having her brother's voice in the back of her head, but that seemed to die off in book two. It's back. And so I can't help but think that all of these are very like the same voice that Zane was hearing, basically. Ruin or the mists or whatever are like trying to influence people by speaking to them. So that's something that's going on, I suppose. We are also learning more about the different creatures or beasts, I suppose you might call them, of this land. Primarily there's like the Kandra or the Kandra, the Colossus, and the Inquisitors. And all of them have very specific powers that are different from allomancy but seem to somehow relate to allomancy, whether that means that they're super influenced by it or they're super powerful, whatever. So we're learning more about how these creatures have been created and that they're all connected. And Spook did gain this secondary power after nearly dying, so I'm sure it has something to do with these magical spikes that everybody has, and that's probably connected to the voice as well. Another thing that feels very similar with this book as the previous two is that we have 3 female characters. Of course, Vin is the main one, but there are 2 other ones. Allran or Allrain or something is a carryover from book 2, who she was like secretly an allomancer the whole time, but we weren't supposed to suspect her because she's a woman. She's there, and I think she's married to Breeze now, but she doesn't seem to be very influential, at least so far. And because we know that Brandon Sanderson likes to kill off women, obviously we needed a 3rd woman to enter into this book. And her name is Beldre, I think. And she is the sister of the citizen, the guy who's running the city where Spook is and killing all the nobles. And Spook seems to have this really weird, honestly a bit creepy kind of crush on her. He's obsessed with her even though he doesn't really know anything about her. As with the first 2 books, there is a lot of dialogue and a lot of over-explaining, so it just feels so much longer than I think it needs to be. Also, Sarzed, who I'm assuming is the Brandon Sanderson self-insert, is just having a massive crisis of faith this entire book. And normally I find that existential, religious, spiritual kind of confrontation within the self to be quite interesting and compelling, but that's literally all Sarzed is doing in this book, and it's a long book. So I'm even bored by that. Like, we get it. You're sad that your girlfriend died and now you don't know what to believe. Is anything worth believing in? I get it. But it's just not that compelling or complex with him. Every time we're in his perspective, it's just the same thing over and over and over again. I don't know, man. I really want to be able to just finish this, to say that I finished it, to tick it off, and to move on with my life and never have to think about it again. But I'm finding it an absolute slog. So imagine me on my couch, plodding through one of the most boring books I've read in a long time, The Hero of Ages, when I start to notice some very clear patterns. So basically, in the city where Spook is, we're sort of setting up a bit of a storyline with Spook overthrowing the citizen. He's a Scar man who has taken control of the city in the north, and Spook is there in this city to sort of get some information to potentially make this citizen and this city an ally of Elend. But he's taking it all pretty seriously and getting a bit hot-headed. But anyway, he is convinced that the citizen is an allomancer, which would mean he would have noble blood, which would mean he is a hypocrite. And so Spook is obsessed with drawing him out and proving to everybody that he is an allomancer, and so that the whole city will like rebel and overthrow him. Meanwhile, his sister is meek and quiet, and she's in the background, and Spook is obsessed with her and has this weird incel-y vibe crush on her. And I'm just here having flashbacks to the first book and to the second book, where we had a woman sitting in the background, sitting on the sideline, who secretly turned out to be an ultra-powerful allomancer. And nobody saw it coming, nobody suspected her. Why? I don't know, I guess just because women are weak, and why would you expect that they would be powerful? So I'm sitting here and I'm reading about Beldre and her brother and Spook, and I'm like, Brandon Sanderson, this motherfucker is not about to do the exact same thing he did in book 1 and book 2. And I remember saying in my vlog of the Well of Ascension how repetitive it felt, him doing this twice. Because it feels so similar. And I said the only reason you would do it twice is if you genuinely think people would not suspect a woman. And so it felt so obvious, these red herrings. But at the same time, I still held out hope that Brandon Sanderson could not be that predictable and a paint-by-numbers author. Well, joke's on me, because Beldre is, of course, secretly an allomancer. Oh my god. Anyway, I'm gonna calm down, because in order to get through this book, which is just, honestly, it's giving me an aneurysm, I've decided to make it into a game. I have written down a list of predictions that I think are going to happen in this book. Obviously, we've already got one big one out of the way at the beginning of the video, that I think Sazed is the hero of ages. I'm still convinced of it. Obviously, I was pretty sure Beldre was an allomancer. The only reason I was doubting myself is because I just could not imagine an author pulling the same trick 3 times in a row, but I shouldn't have overestimated Brandon Sanderson, clearly. So I'm going to read out a handful of other predictions that I have for the remainder of the book, because kind of like playing this silly little bingo game with myself is the only way I can imagine getting through the rest of this damn book. My first prediction is that one of the 3 named women in this book are gonna die, because that has happened in the previous 2 books, and as we've established, Brandon Sanderson is a man of pattern. I'm not quite convinced which woman it's gonna be just yet, but one of them's gonna die. And obviously I'm going on the assumption that Sazed is the hero of ages, so I think Vin is going to like sacrifice herself in some big grand kind of way. So maybe she is the woman that's gonna die. Although I wouldn't be entirely surprised if it was Beldre and like the whole point was fridging for the sake of like Spook's personal development. I don't know, we've done that before in a book too. I think Spook is gonna die. I don't know, it just feels like Spook is being set up to, I don't know, be this weird sort of Kelsier replacement, and I just don't see it quite happening. So yeah, my money's on Spook dying. I think I've already said this, but the voice that Spook and Vin are hearing are the same voice that Zane was hearing in the second book. I think the good guys are gonna win. I think Brandon Sanderson is the kind of author to want to round things off in like a fairly happy kind of way. The good guys are going to win, but I don't think it's going to be like an outright, they just kill Ruin, because it's made very clear that Ruin is like an entity, a force of nature, and that without Ruin, life cannot exist. So I think it's going to be like a amalgamation of Ruin and preservation or something. Something's going to happen where Ruin is just like tamed, not like destroyed. I think that's pretty obvious though, right? Like any story that's about like 2 opposing but connected forces of nature, like that's kind of how it has to end. Kind of connected with Sazed being the hero of ages, I think, I mean, I already said, but like this entire book, every single time we're in his point of view, it is just about his crisis of faith. So him finding his faith again, or some kind of new acceptance of faith and what it means for him, is going to be like the culmination of the book. It's going to be the big moment that he realizes he's the hero or whatever. Like religion and Sazed's religious experience is very much tied to him being the hero and like the big ending of the book. Atium, I haven't really spoken about Atium so much in this video, but basically Atium is this like extra metal that Vin discovered earlier, where she found out that if she consumes it, she can be like super ultra powerful. And they have always believed that the Lord Ruler had like a stash of it somewhere. And Vin is obsessed with it in this book, obsessed with finding it. And again, the way she literally says, I don't know why I'm so obsessed with Atium, but we need to find it. It's like her driving force. It feels exactly like what we saw from her with the Well of Ascension in the second book. She was obsessed with finding the Well of Ascension. And she literally even said sometimes she didn't know why. It was just like this compulsion. And then we turned out it's because she was being drawn to it by Ruin. I think it's the same thing. The ATM is like a misdirection, or Ruin wants the ATM or something. There is going to be a fake out death. There has to be a fake out death. It cannot be a Brandon Sanderson novel without a fake out death. And this is less a prediction and more just a hope, a genuine hope. I really hope that Ellen dies. Honestly, I hate the man. I hate him as a character. He is so boring. He is built up to be something that he, like Brandon Sanderson, does not demonstrate him to be, which is wise. And I hate him. And he was supposed to die. I mean, like, he did die at the end of the second book. He was just magically brought back to life. So it just would feel right, you know, if Ellen died. So that's my little predictions bingo board that I've made for myself. Gamifying this is the only way I can see myself getting through the rest of this book. I have finally finished A Hero of Ages, and along with it, Mistborn Era 1. And what a roller coaster ride it has been. Most of it has been downhill. I honestly disliked this book so much that I do not want to give you a play-by-play of what happened. Partly because not a lot actually happens. It's not very interesting in my point of view. And an awful lot of it is very predictable. There's a lot of ticks on my bingo card right now. Sazed is the hero of ages. And yet, I still don't feel satisfied. And that is almost the worst part of this whole thing. I thought that if I got all the way through this godforsaken book, I would feel some kind of gratification, not only having finished my personal first like high fantasy adult series, but also the gratification of knowing I was right. We all love that feeling, don't we? And yet here I am just feeling a little bit hollow, because as you could tell from the previous clips, I think this is boring as hell. And even though obviously with the Sanderlanche, stuff starts happening more quickly at with 200 pages to go, fast, boring stuff is still boring. So I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to have to go through the specifics of what happens in this book, because personally, I don't think it's interesting. But what we will do is go over my predictions and find out how many I got right. And then I will have a bit of a chat of my overall thoughts, and I suppose do a bit of a review. So my predictions. Obviously, I got Sazed is the hero of ages. I feel like I deserve a big fat tick for that one. The one that I got wrong, Spook will die. He did not. However, if you recall, one of my other predictions was that there would be a fake out death. And do you know who got the fake out death? It was Spook. It was Spook. We all thought he died. He walked into a burning building and like it was like fade to black. And then a couple of chapters later, he's like lying in bed with like casts all over him. At least one of the three women will die. Yes, got that right. Vin will sacrifice herself. Yes, Vin is the one who died. The voices that Spook and Vin were hearing were the same voices that Zane was hearing in the second book. Yep, easy, got that one right. They will win, but not completely. To be fair, this prediction is pretty vague, but like in principle, I think I'm right. Ruin was not destroyed, it was brought together with preservation. In the character of Sazed, who is the hero of ages because he doesn't have balls. Sazed will find his faith and it will be a big moment. Absolutely, big tick for that. ATM is a misdirection for Vin. Again, I'm correct. And then finally, not a prediction, but a hope, was that Ellen would die. And even though I hated this book almost as much as I hated Well of Ascension, Brandon Sanderson did give me one gift, and that was to kill off Ellen. So I can't be entirely mad. So depending on how you want to score me for some of those more vague predictions, I think I did pretty damn well. And I am not someone who usually is good at predicting endings. So I am not saying these predictions and telling you that I got them all right in order to like tell you that I'm smart or something, because I don't think that's true. What I hope this demonstrates is that Brandon Sanderson is a paint-by-numbers, hugely predictable author. Well of Ascension Book 2 and The Hero of Ages Book 3 have so many plot points and reveals that are exactly the same as each other. Like, so many of those predictions that I listed had nothing to do with like clever foreshadowing. They were literally just things that had happened in previous books, so I guessed they would probably happen in this one too. So I want to talk about the 3 pages of this book that I enjoyed. And that does sound absolutely ridiculous given how long this is, but it's true. And that is basically, without having to go through every single little detail, it turns out that the mists are actually the force of preservation, and Vin takes all of the mists within her to essentially like become preservation. And she does this little cloud dance battle with Ruin. But because Ruin and preservation are like, you know, opposing forces of the same coin sort of vibes, she can't like defeat Ruin, but she gives it a good old whack after she finds out that Ellen has died. But then she sacrifices herself, and Sazed realizes that actually he is the hero. He's been the hero all along, and he has this big religious faith awakening thing. And the character who's spent the entire book going through his list of hundreds of religions that his people have studied and figuring out what's wrong with all of them and the flaws of all of them and why they're inconsistent and not worth believing in, he's now finding out that they they all hold nuggets of truth that can help him save the world. And honestly, I thought that was kind of cute. It was predictable, but it was kind of cute. However, it is just a tad ironic that all of the things that we read that Sazed uses from these religions that help him save the world are actually just like scientific facts. They're not like religious philosophical doctrine or ideas. They're just science. Like, for example, he's got to put the earth back in the right spot, like the right distance away from the sun so that it's not so hot. In order to do so, he uses the knowledge of one of the religions that he studied that worshipped stars, or like had a really good understanding of the stars. And so he can use like the sky and the stars to figure out where the earth is supposed to be. Super cute, but not a religious idea. Also, there's another one like about human anatomy and stuff. So I don't know, it kind of felt like the whole point that Brandon Sanderson was making with this character of Sazed and this whole religious roller coaster he's been on. I don't think he was making the point he thought he was making. But anyway, I'm not going to nitpick on the only 3 pages that I actually kind of liked. Instead, we've got some notes. Let's go over the things I really hated. So obviously this book felt hugely predictable, but it was also hugely repetitive. And not only in the plot points between books 2 and 3, like I've already said, but also like internally. Brandon Sanderson was just constantly beating us over the head with the same stuff, as if we would have forgotten what happened in the previous chapter. Now, I do get sort of giving your readers some cues so that they can, you know, stay up to date with the information that you're giving them. But we're constantly being reminded of shit that we've learned about characters from book 1, like that Vin lived on the streets. We have to be reminded of that every chapter. Elend having his whole crisis around leadership and his ethics. Vin having her whole crisis about whether she can be a street urchin who's good at fighting and running away, and also be a noble lady who likes to dress up in pretty ball gowns. Like, all of these things have been things that we have been beaten over the head with for at least the last 2 books. That is a lot of pages of repetition. Like, he's trying so hard to set up this consistency with precedents that it just becomes repetitive. Also, it felt like in this book we did a lot of revisioning of the Lord Ruler. So the Lord Ruler was the big bad in the first book who the crew and Kelsier overthrew at the end of the first book. He was this godlike kind of ruler who'd been the emperor for 1,000 years. And life under him was hugely oppressive and fucked up. Like, we had that made very clear to us in the first book, how badly oppressed the Scar in particular were. Scar women were literally raped and murdered, and that was just like part of their culture and lifestyle. Like, it was messed up. And by the 3rd book, we're sort of like doing this revisionist thing that maybe the Lord Ruler, I mean, maybe he didn't get it all right, but he actually was a good guy trying to take care of his citizens. And that kind of felt like an example of Brandon Sanderson trying to do grey morality, but instead it just felt revisionist and kind of like rape apologisty. Like, it didn't work. And of course, some will say, oh no, he was trying to do the right thing, but he was being influenced by ruin, and that's why sometimes he would do bad things anyway. And that leads me to something else, which is that so many things that feel inconsistent or unsatisfying can just be explained by, oh no, it was ruin's influence though. That leaves me as a reader midway through a book realizing that everything is kind of controlled in the background by this malevolent force of nature. Everything I'm reading is pointless? Does that make sense? Like, kind of having a ruin orchestrated at all, get out of jail free card for any inconsistencies just feels like a total cop-out and makes me as a reader feel like I'm wasting my time. Basically, it doesn't feel like there's any purpose to what our characters are doing, or that there's any purpose to the plot that we're reading about. And then some of the other things that I didn't like about this is that ultimately by the end, it just feels like some kind of weird Christian fan fiction, with Kelsier set up as this kind of like resurrected savior, like a total stand-in for some Jesus figure, and like the forces of good and evil battling out on Earth. And so much of the page length of book 3 taken up with Sazed, like questioning about what the point of faith is and how we believe in a world that is ending, and what the point of connection and romance is in a world that, you know, you don't even know if there's an afterlife. And by the end, we find out that there is an afterlife. Like, it feels like Christian fan fiction. Although in this book it is mixed in with a healthy dose of like weird fedora tipping Reds under the bed scare cautionary tale stuff. What I mean by this is the city that Spook was in, where the citizen, the Scar leader, was sort of in charge of the city and living by the values that they kind of assumed Kelsier had, where Scar were in charge of an entire city and they slaughtered all the nobles. And I think that is pretty consistent with plenty of the criticisms I had of Well of Ascension, where Brandon Sanderson's exploration of oppression and oppressed peoples is really clumsy. In the second book, there was so much discussion of like the Scar, these oppressed peoples, not being able, like capable of leadership and not being capable of being in charge, and basically like wanting nobles to continue kind of oppressing them, maybe just being a little less mean about it. And I think Brandon Sanderson's views on this were made extra clear in this book when we had two very distinct cities that we were spending a lot of time in. One was this city up in the north that was run by Scar, and that was presented as total chaos, and the leader of which was presented as a hypocrite, which was the worst thing anyone could be. Meanwhile, the city that Elend and Vin spent a lot of time at was run by a nobleman who very much believed in the ways of the Lord Ruler and who was wanting to maintain the lifestyle that existed before the Lord Ruler was overthrown. And he is presented as, yes, a bit of a villain, a bit of a challenge to Elend, but also presented as a reasonable, cunning philosopher. And Vin even says at one point that she kind of had to give him credit because, you know, the rest of the world was going to chaos, but at least this city, there was structure and stability. And basically that was demonstrated by the fact that the nobles were still holding balls. They were still oppressing their Scar, and the world was literally ending around them, but because they had some semblance of stability that relied on oppression and enslavement, maybe it was better than the chaos of the Scar leadership. Like, that juxtaposition was presented to us very clearly, and I think it was supposed to have a very clear message. And I don't agree with the assumptions Brandon Sanderson made about people, about oppressed people, and human behavior in order to create these two distinct examples of different kinds of leadership. And I don't agree with the assumptions he made about which ones are preferable and which ones aren't, and which ones are sustainable and which ones aren't. And then, of course, there is just some good old-fashioned ableism, including mental health discrimination thrown in there as well. The ableism towards people with physical disabilities was kind of under the surface. It was there in the second book, but it was never explicitly said. We get that explicitly in the third book. There's a pretty powerful character named Set who is now allied with Elend, and he is physically disabled. I can't remember the specifics of his disability, but I think he's paralyzed from the waist down. And in the second book, there was a lot of Vin assuming that he couldn't be so weak, like he had to be an Allomancer because someone in a position of power couldn't possibly be disabled, and that was a bit icky. In this book, we get Elend just outright being ableist, literally with his words. When Elend makes a decision and one of the other characters, you know, sort of raises it to Elend that, oh, I don't think Set's going to be happy about your decision, Elend literally says something along the lines of, well, he's a paraplegic, what's he gonna do? Great, so we don't listen to disabled people because they can't physically harm us? Is that the message? And then with the mental health stuff, which I took great issue with in the second book, it's not as prevalent here, but it's still sprinkled throughout. And that again primarily comes with the voice, which is of Ruin. Ruin is basically using like metal, whether it's an earring or a spike or whatever, to be able to influence people's thoughts. And it's made pretty clear throughout the book that Ruin finds it easier to influence people who are weak-willed or more mentally unstable. I think it's literally said people with unstable personalities on page 613, in case you want to fact check me. But it is like an insinuation throughout the book. And I don't know about you, but that just sounded so much like that Christian and religious rhetoric of mentally ill people being weak-minded or weak-willed and therefore more susceptible to the influence of the devil. Like, it just read so gross to me, especially after the way Brandon Sanderson treated the character of Zane. Again, if you haven't watched my second video and you don't know what I'm talking about or you disagree with me, please go watch that video because I was very clear about how and why that was a harmful choice. Anyway, I'm going to dial it back a bit and talk about my last couple of more petty criticisms. Petty in comparison to literal ableism anyway. One of those is the little short journal entries we get at the beginning of every chapter. We've gotten that through all three books from different people's journals. I loved that narrative choice in the first book. I thought it was really clever and it was used very effectively. We were basically getting the story of the person we thought was going to end up being the hero of ages as the rest of our like current day narrative was going through. And I just thought that was really well done. And I think I even said in that first video that I was almost enjoying that story more than I was the actual story. In the second book, it was less interesting. In the third book though, it literally functions as an info dump. It doesn't add to the story. It doesn't give us a secondary sort of narrative to follow. Instead, it is literally an opportunity for Brandon Sanderson to info dump some little tidbits or to make sure that there's no holes in his logic. You're literally only putting that in there so that people can't call you out on like a little inconsistency in your hard magic system. It felt so unnecessary and totally took me out of the story. Those are all the reasons I hated this. I have to say I didn't hate it quite as much as I hated The Well of Ascension. That book I hated with like a strong, fervent passion. Like this is the kind of book that I will reference as one of the worst books I've ever read. This book instead just feels like a huge disappointment. It feels thoroughly unsatisfying. And I'm annoyed at it in the sense that I'm annoyed that I wasted my time on it. But I don't feel like mad in the same way I felt about The Well of Ascension. And I think that's kind of telling, that this book was so dull that it inspired no passion in me, no excitement, no anger, nothing. I feel so utterly hollow after finishing this. And in a way, isn't that almost worse? I don't know. I know I'm gonna get all you Sando fans at the comments like saying that I shouldn't have gone into this if I knew I would hate it. But I mean, you've all been bullying me for 3 months to read it because you were convinced I would love it. Look, I know there's no pleasing you. I know you're probably all gonna be telling me that I need to read the Stormlight Archive because that's actually Brandon Sanderson's like masterpiece. Can we not just agree to disagree? I clearly don't like Brandon Sanderson as a storyteller and as an author. I'm not telling you that you're not allowed to like his books. And it almost feels like sometimes a lot of Sanderfans are so convinced of Sanderson's genius, like absolutely irrefutable genius, that the idea that someone doesn't love him is like not possible. It doesn't compute. I think Brandon Sanderson is at his best when he's being playful and he's having fun with his story. And he's got a bit of a lightness to the characters and to what they're doing. And maybe that's why I enjoyed Skyward a little bit more, because it was a little bit more fun. Like, it was still kind of intense, but there was a lightness there. Having said that, after this experience, I have no desire to continue with Skyward or anything Brandon Sanderson. I have 2 unread Sanderson books on my shelf and I'm getting rid of them. Like, this is the last for me. As I said, I think 5 books for an author is hugely generous. I mean, I've read more Brandon Sanderson books than I have of most authors, and I won't be putting myself through a 6th. Anyway, thanks so much for being here. A big thank you to my wonderful Patreons, and especially a big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And I will see you in another video very soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.